The Institute of World Affairs at UWM and Milwaukee Public Television present International Focus, a global magazine linking Wisconsin and the world.
Welcome to International Focus. I'm Doug Savage from the Institute of World Affairs at UWM with another edition of our World Affairs Roundup. Today we'll be looking at the shores of Tripoli. Some observers have suggested that President's handling of the Libyan uprising represents an evolving Obama doctrine on the use of military force. Is this truly a new policy or just more of the same? Answering Assad, protesters in Syria were largely unimpressed with a much-anticipated address by President Bashar al-Assad. Could Damascus be the next Middle Eastern domino to fall, and if so, would the regime's fall impact the region? Merkel's meltdown. Chancellor Angela Merkel's party lost control of a key state it has held for 58 years. Analysts point to the party's stance on nuclear energy in the wake of Japan's crisis as a key factor in the defeat. How is this nuclear reaction playing out in the rest of Europe and beyond? Endgame in Abidjan. Ivory Coast's disputed presidential election moved to a chaotic climax as troops loyal to internationally recognized winner Alassane Ouattara dislodged Laurent Gbagbo, the incumbent who refused to stand down. What's the backstory, and is there an American connection? To help us explore these issues and more, we're joined as usual by John Katka, a retired U.S. Foreign Service officer who has conducted public diplomacy for the Department of State on 4 continents. Ann Hamilton, political scientist and coordinator of international studies at UW-Whitewater, who also served in the U.S. Foreign Service. And Robert Kraig, author of a number of articles and books dealing with the history and politics of American foreign policy. He currently serves as Executive Director of Citizen Action of Wisconsin. Well, welcome back, everyone, to International Focus. John, we find ourselves once again deploying military assets in the Middle East. Give us a little bit of background, if you would, on the situation in Libya.
There's an excellent Reuters piece that came out Friday, and since we also should tell our viewers that we're taping this on Friday because the events are moving quickly, and by the time they watch this on Sunday, things could intervene and make some of the things we say not correct. The piece, the Reuters piece, is called The Unwanted War, and it tracks the way in which the various parties became involved. And it goes back to early March and Sarkozy's interest in this, largely for domestic reasons. And the way in which a left-of-center French philosopher by the name of Henri Lévy became involved with the Benghazi group and convinced Sarkozy to back them and push this, and then Great Britain became involved, and the U.S., as read it, was holding back, and this evolved very carefully, not for reasons that were related to Libya, but for a lot of reasons external. Germany held back because of their concern about Poles that said that there was a pacifist direction in there. The Arab League joined, but the African Union did not. So there was a very complicated buildup to the UN vote where there were 5 abstentions as opposed to use of the veto power. And there's an interesting point that I've picked up as well, that apparently the United States has agreed to support Russia's entry into the World Trade Organization despite Georgia's protests that followed after the UN vote. So that's kind of a build-up to the vote itself.
Well, and much has been made of President Obama's speech on the subject, and whether or not this was an articulation of an Obama doctrine. He seemed to suggest there were some criteria for military intervention. For example, the scale of the violence, the unique U.S. ability to stop it, having an international mandate, a broad coalition, and a plea for help from the region. So what do you think? Is this a policy that's particular to Libya, or is there an Obama doctrine?
I think it is largely particular to Libya, and I think he said that in the speech. I think that he made it clear that we're doing this because we can. On the other hand, he also said that, when he articulated the fact that if there were vital U.S. interests involved, we would not hesitate to go in unilaterally to protect our interests. However, if there were large-scale, say, humanitarian crises going on, the U.S. would respond consistent with our values, but that we would need to do that with the international community working with us. And so in that extent, he set up a set of rules, but he made it very clear that this was not going to be something that we could expect to see all around the world.
So what about that? I mean, is it useful or desirable to have some sort of template for predictable intervention?
Well, probably not. And I agree, it's a doctrine that denies any doctrines and as a case-by-case approach, because everyone wants to say, well, these criteria mean we need to go into Ivory Coast, we need to go into Yemen, and each country is very different. So I think from a foreign policy standpoint, it makes much more sense to have some sort of case-by-case balancing of our ideals, our interests, our capacity, what's really at stake. President Obama made it clear that there's about to be a slaughter at a level perhaps of a genocide that we could prevent without putting ground troops in. So that's a very distinct situation that probably isn't going to be reproduced anywhere else in the world. So I think that's better than having a doctrine. The press would like a doctrine because they want to say, does this mean you'll do this or not do that? Or the other, and it's a good thing to talk about on pundit shows such as this, but it doesn't make a whole lot of sense from a standpoint of diplomacy or a sensible foreign policy.
So that's what this is.
Well, what about that? I mean, wasn't there some hint that sort of our values would animate our policy in some way?
Well, my problem with the speech is he tried to equate values with national interest. And they're contradictory terms often. The values are underwriting goals as a people. Our national interests are much more pragmatic. And in Libya, there is very little national interest that is involved. I agree that the prevention of bloodshed is consistent with our values, but we see bloodshed going on all over the world where we let it go on. My concern is, and I got several concerns on this. One is that where do you draw the line? We ignore what goes on in Bahrain because we have vested interests there, but we do get involved in Libya. How do we pick the winners and losers in this thing? There are reports that Al-Qaeda is involved in the Benghazi group. We've anointed them as freedom fighters and Democrats, and without really knowing anything about them. So I'm very concerned about what this means and where we're going.
So, Anne, how do we protect ourselves from charges of hypocrisy then? If we say, you know, these are the criteria in which we'll intervene, and they seem largely value-based.
Well, I think we're always going to get charges of hypocrisy. But I think that when John was asking, how do we choose where to intervene, I think that actually the bar was set pretty high in terms of the process. You have to have regional organizations agreeing to this, all the powers of the Security Council and the others that have to vote for it, a decision to commit troops by not just the United States but other countries, and that is and really involving the international institutions in this process. Now, some might say that, well, that's the wrong way to do it, and it may well prove to be the wrong way to do it, but it's that type of convergence is not going to come very often, I don't think. So,
can I interrupt one second?
Yes, of course.
My concern is, okay, we arrived at the Security Council decision, and we had reasonably broad support and no real opposition, but it has evolved since then. And the Arab League is already distancing itself from what's going on. So we're seeing creep. What's
mission creep?
Mission creep. Thank you. Mm-hmm. That's already beginning to occur. Commanders get in charge. They want to accomplish what they need to do. We saw it in Kosovo, where they overstepped and bombed stuff that they shouldn't have bombed. We're seeing it already in Libya.
Well, we've got no shortage of scenarios in which we can apply some of these policies. Let's move quickly before our break, if we could, to Syria, Robert.
Sorry.
You know, are we? Do we have any of the same kinds of compelling reasons to intervene there?
Not if you take President Obama's speech and the criterion laid out as Ann described, you would not, even though certainly what goes on there is going to have a huge impact on our interest in the Middle East and the interest of peace in the Middle East in general. But you don't have any easy intervention that could affect it. In fact, it's a much more complicated situation because it appears that Israel will be happier having an enemy they know, the devil they know, so to speak, in the Assad regime, than they would in possible unrest and an unknown leadership, even Islamicist leadership potentially coming from the Sunni majority in the country. And so it's a much vaguer situation. But the Arab Spring that applies to Libya obviously applies here, and it's unclear whether the Assad regime can survive long term. It may be able to with very harsh repression, which is very well known for, but then again, it may not be a sustainable structure. And so I think that it's a situation where you're very unlikely. In fact, a U.S. intervention, even a U.S. involvement intervention, would cause tremendous problems in the region and would cause a huge backlash and not even achieve whatever objective we might have. So I think it's related in terms of this democracy movement across North Africa and the Middle East, but not as far as a military involvement by the U.S.
Well, and you know, we've seen hopes on the part of Washington to sort of woo Assad away from Iran and somehow change that equation. He made this much anticipated speech. Is there any evidence that there's much hope in that policy going forward?
No, his speech was a little bit like President Mubarak's the night before he resigned. It was a total shock. People there had been, they thought that at least he was going to lift the state of emergency, but he didn't, and a lot of people were shocked by that. And so I agree that we're unlikely to see we're unlikely to see the U.S. intervene. I think that there is definitely a Syrian spring happening here, but I don't think it's going to go as far as the others because I think it will be repressed.
Well, John, we've got just about a minute before our break. What are the likely and probably a different set of possible scenarios?
Well, the difference between Syria and Libya is there's no foreign media really involved. We don't have the television cameras going on that are recording the violence, people being killed, and that was extremely important in Europe in terms of moving publics, and in the United States in terms of moving us towards action, because the president really wasn't enthusiastic about moving in the direction of Libya. So I think that the role of the media is an important component in this process.
Well, we're going to take a short break, and we'll move on to another part of the world when we come back with more World Affairs Roundup.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Which one's you?
Welcome back to International Focus. We're talking once again with John Katka, Ann Hamilton, and Robert Kraig. Well, let's move now to the regional elections in Germany. Chancellor Merkel's party suffered what can only be considered a historical defeat in that after ruling for 58 years, they lost to, of all parties, the Greens. So, Robert, how significant is this both to the National Governance Coalition and the sort of sub-issue of nuclear energy?
Well, it's a little bit hard to tell because the nuclear issue is so substantial and happened right before the election with the catastrophe in Japan, and so we don't know whether or not they would have lost this election. It would have been much closer no matter what, but whether they would actually lost it without the nuclear situation. But the nuclear situation itself is extremely important as we are at peak oil and we need alternative energy sources. There's been this attempt to offer nuclear as the alternative rather than deeper investment in other greener technologies. And what happened in Japan, as happened before in Chernobyl or 3 Mile Island, has certainly changed that debate everywhere but France, apparently, where there's great commitment to nuclear power. And so Germany, like the United States, is on the skittish side of this. And I mean, I identify with that and agree. And it's affected government in Germany tremendously, and I think built on problems that the Merkel coalition already had. But push it over the top, at least in one key, in one key state.
Well, and what in the run-up to that election, there were some interesting policy shifts on the part of Angela Merkel regarding Germany's nuclear plants. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Well, they had announced a policy of, I believe it was a very ambitious pro-nuclear policy prior to the elections, and then once the earthquake happened in Japan, they said that they were going to put a moratorium on it for 3 months, I believe. And that was seen as hypocritical, just to try and win the election. So that actually worked against her. It goes to, I mean, it is an interesting situation in Germany because of the strength of the Green Party and the role that it's played, you know, sort of as a coalition partner in various governments. And so it's politically, it's a different situation. Well, all the countries are different, obviously, but it's an important situation because everything converged at the right time to make this a really important issue.
So, John, does this have legs beyond Germany? I mean, is the sort of echoes of the situation in Japan likely to reverberate?
Yes, in the short term, certainly. And much of it can be positive in terms of reviewing how we go about dealing with nuclear energy. I've been hearing reports about the level of safety concerns at the Japanese reactors, and which were highly critical of what they had been doing. On the German elections, there's a couple other points that need to also, since we're talking about them. Germany's support, economic support for bailing out a number of other countries is also a domestic issue. And this, in a very prosperous area, this could be an important component. And also, Germany played a dissenting role in EU policy on Libya. And the press in Germany became highly critical of Merkel and her government, and that also could have played a role in this election.
Well, let's move on to Africa and what's going on in Ivory Coast. And maybe you could give us a little background of the conflict.
Well, the conflict has its origins in a civil war that's been going on for many years. But there was an election in November that was supposed to resolve the conflict between the parties in the civil war. And then the results of that election were disputed. And since that election, the two contenders have been fighting it out and with a great deal of violence. And the person who was recognized, Ouattara, who was recognized by the international community as the winner in the election, has been holed up in a hotel in Abidjan. But his forces coming from the north have been fighting and planning an attack on Abidjan. And in the last few days, they've made a lot of incursions and taken over a lot of towns, and they're now, in fact, when this show airs, in fact, this may have been resolved in some way, but they're actually, the Gbagbo, who was the incumbent, people are defecting from him, and he's really, they say it's the end game.
So, Robert, let's talk a little bit about that election. I mean, who recognized the results?
Well, almost the UN and other national bodies recognized the challenger as winning the election. The incumbent, Mr. Gbagbo, refused to yield power, which led to what amounts to a civil war, which the incumbent seems to be losing at this point, and certainly will lose from everything we know. And there's also a division along regional lines. The North has been operating separately from the South since at least the early 90s, and this is supposed to reunify the country. And on religious grounds, the challenger was Muslim, and the incumbent is Christian. In fact, has received support from right-wing Christians in the United States, such as Pat Robertson and Senator James Inhofe. So that has become somewhat of an issue in some media. And so at this point, though, it appears that the candidate from the North that represents the North, the Muslim candidate, is going to take power, and he is the rightful victor. The question is whether there's a major bloodbath in the dominant city in the Ivory Coast or not, and whether or not stability can be brought back to return the Ivory Coast to what it was, which was one of the models of economic prosperity in all of Africa, quite frankly, but which has been now destroyed by this conflict.
Well, John, you know, if we look at the scale of this conflict, I mean, estimates of 1 million people displaced, fatalities certainly in the hundreds, if not higher. Does this not rise to the level of requiring intervention?
Well, in this case, we would say this is a French problem. This is a former French colony. The French were active in suppressing the Muslim uprising, I believe it was 2002. And allowing Gbagbo to come back into power. And they are there. There's 1,000 UN troops there, and there's a French.
10,000.
Is it 10,000?
I think so.
No, I thought it was 1,000 peacekeepers protecting 10,000 refugees.
Oh, okay. All right.
Okay, something like that.
Something.
There's a lot of blue helmets in there.
Yes, there's a lot of blue helmets, and there's a French military base there, where lots of the foreigners have gone for safety. But this really is a French problem. They understand the issues. They have much involved in it. France treats these former colonies much more closely than, say, Britain does its former colonies. Much closer relationship between them. So I think that the French are very much involved in, and we don't need to be.
So is that an aspect, circling back to this notion of an Obama doctrine, is part of the caveat that if it does offend our sensibilities, but there are alternatives in terms of who should intervene, we should stand down?
Well, I actually see this as a very different issue, in part because there are already UN peacekeepers there, but in part also because they've been following a process. They set up elections, they had observers there, they came out with their judgment as to whether or not these results were official. You know, it's been playing itself out slowly. There have been, through the UN peacekeepers and through the French, there have been at least some efforts to prevent a lot more bloodshed. But so I think that the process has been following one that has been endorsed really by the international community as I mean, people don't like it. They don't like the fact that there's this disputed leadership and the potential for great bloodshed, but they've already, in a sense, they've intervened in through the actions that they've taken. It's a different kind of intervention. And I think that the role of the media too is important. Now there's a lot more on TV, but you know, with the crises in Egypt and Tunisia and all those, this crisis really took a back seat. So it's in the front.
It's not as sexy as some of the others.
Yeah.
Well, and Robert, how much does geography play a role in this? I mean, is it the fact that the media in general are just less interested in some way in African conflicts?
I think there's an aspect of that. There's an aspect of whether we have the capacity to intervene. There's John's point that there's another power that could intervene that is already there. I do think that we don't need another Rwanda to take place, and obviously there's still a lot of hand-wringing and guilt, understandable guilt about that. So I do disagree with what John said at the beginning of the program about not letting the values and our interests be confused. I think we have to look at our values as the last great hope for democracy in our foreign policy, and that has to be a factor. The Obama doctrine is to look at each case very specifically and to factor all of these out on a case-by-case basis, and not to have simple, hard and fast rules that say we have to intervene here and not here.
Yeah, I wasn't saying that values are not important. I'm just saying values are not national interests. They're different.
Well, one of the sort of leitmotifs running through much of our discussion today was what happens when these leaders are eventually driven from power. And filming as we are on April 1st, I'm happy to report that a Middle East broadcast outlet is proposing a solution to what becomes of these leaders, currently in negotiation for a new reality television show, Dancing with the Dictators.
It's a new two-step.
It is, absolutely. So that's a show we'll all stay tuned, and certainly there'll be no shortage of new contestants, it seems, as we go on. Well, and with that, to our viewers, stay tuned, and I'll look forward to seeing you at the ballpark.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220, or visit us at our website.